Welcome to this video. We talked about Git already, which allowed us to control different versions of our code locally on our machine. In this video, it's time to bring our code to the cloud. So basically, we will push our code from our local repository to a web-based, to a remote repository. And for that, we will use GitHub. Now, let's find out how this works. Now, as I said, GitHub allows us to store our local Git repositories in the cloud. So we turn them into remote repositories. For that, we first need, a repository. So let's quickly create a new Git project, not GitHub, Git. Right here, I'm using Visual Studio Code. Use the code editor of your choice, of course. So in here, I'll create a new folder, maybe name it GitHub, like that. And then I will open this folder. And let's maybe quickly add an index.html file. One right here. Then open the terminal right there. And now simply initialize our Git repository right here, our local repository. Add the change, commit the change like that. Say start. And then let's maybe add a second change because I want to have two commits in my branch. Just saying text. And let's also add this text right here, maybe written correctly like that. And then we will add a text. And then we will have our two commits right here. As we can see, if we go to Git branch, we only have our master branch, of course. And if we log that, we have our two commits. That's everything we know so far. So how can we now get this local repository to a remote repository, so a repository on GitHub? Well, for that, we first need to go to github.com right here and create an account. The account is generally for free if you make your repositories accessible to the public. If you want to have private repositories, so repositories that can only be viewed by you basically, or the people you allow to do so, then it's not for free. But normally the public ones should be sufficient. So as I said, create such a free GitHub account and then simply click right here onto this plus and add a new repository. You can now give this repository a name. I will just name it Git. And my description will also be really long by just saying Git. And now you can see the difference between the public and the private repository. As I said, I will stick to the public one. And then you can decide if you want to initialize your repository with a readme. This basically means that this repository right here would already contain some data, some information. But as you can see right here, we can skip this step if we are importing an existing repository. And that's exactly what we're going to do right here. So we will create this repository without any content and then push the content of our local repository into this remote repository. We'll see how this works in a few seconds. Then we could add a git ignore file or add a license. I will not dive into that right now because for the basics, it's not really that important. So let's skip this. And let's now press create repository right here. With that, our repository is created. And you can also see it right here. You can see my username, this one right here. And here you can see our repository right there. And you can see we have this Git repository, which we can open right here. But this repository does not contain any kind of code, any kind of information, of course. That's why we have some nice hints right here about what we could do now. The important thing is this one right here, because that's what we want to do. We want to push an existing repository. For that, we simply can use this code right here and paste it into our code editor. And now I could press enter and continue, but then the problem is, what did we write here? So let's have a quick look at what we actually copied. I think the git command is quite clear. Remote add simply means that we want to establish a connection between our local repository, this one right here, and a remote repository, so the repository on GitHub. Origin then is our name for this remote repository because we want to make sure that we establish the connection between a specific remote repository. Therefore, we have to give it a name, of course. And this name typically is origin. You can, of course, also choose a different name, but for the purpose of this basics video, we will simply stick to this origin naming convention. And after that, we also have this URL right here. You could also use SSH, but this is also something we will skip right now because with HTTPS, we can perfectly get started with GitHub and also push our code to, well, GitHub from our local repository. Now with that, we can hit enter now. And well, now nothing changed actually. That's only partially true because if we go back right here and reload that page, you can see we still don't have any branches or something like that. But if we go back to our code and now enter git remote, this command right here, then you can see that we added this remote repository already. This is this origin name. You can also be more specific about that by entering git remote -v like that. Then you can see the origin right here and right there, so the name of the remote repository, and additionally the URL behind that repository. We can see that we have this fetch and push commands right here. We'll have a look at that throughout this video. But the important thing is that now we already have kind of a connection between our local repository and the remote repository on GitHub. But our branches, our commits, are not yet pushed to GitHub. For that, we can simply use this code right here, this one, but I will type it manually. So we will say git push, which basically tells Git to, as the name says, push our branches to this remote repository. Then we add -u. This basically establishes an upstream, you could say, between Git and GitHub. This will simply allow us to write the commands in a more convenient way. So we can simply write git push for the next times we want to push some code. And also for pull, we only have to write pull. You will also see that in a few seconds. So adding -u definitely makes sense right here. And then we add origin because we want to push our branches to the origin remote branch. And then we not only have to specify a repository, but also a branch. And in our case, this is the master branch that we will use. If we now hit enter, then you can see that we are asked to enter a username. That's important because otherwise, well, anybody could push any kind of code to any kind of repository. And that's not the intention of GitHub. The username in our case is right here. This one you can see up here. So this mloam is basically my username, which I will simply copy and enter right here. And then we have to enter the GitHub password. After that, we can now see that the code was pushed to GitHub. And if we go back and reload the page now, we can see that we have one branch right here, our master branch. And inside this branch, if we click right here, we can see the two commits that we created, the start commit and the added text commit. Now, before we continue, one important information about this password implementation we have right here. Because I added another tool right here, which allows me to simply enter my username and my password once, and then it will be saved on my machine. This is a lot more convenient because adding or entering the password again and again, whenever you want to push or pull code up or down from GitHub, that's not really convenient. For that, you can find a link in the video description, which allows you or which shows you how to set up caching for your GitHub password in Git. You basically need this OS keychain helper right here, which allows you to store the password on the Mac. You can then simply enter keychain access right here in the terminal. And if you then search for GitHub, then you can find your internet password, and you could also delete it right here if you want to. But that's basically the way it is stored then on your machine. And this allows you to use Git and GitHub in a more convenient way. That's just a side note though. Let's go back to GitHub. Because we can now see that we established the connection between our local branch and this remote branch. And if we now go back to the code and enter git branch right here, then we can see that we are at the moment in our master branch in our local repository. And by entering git remote after that, we can also see that we have a connection, a link to a remote repository, so a repository on GitHub, which has the name origin. That's the name we defined previously. But if we now enter git branch -r right here, then we can see another thing. We can see this origin master, branch right here. Now what's that? Now, without diving too much into the details, in simple words, this simply means that we have a connection between our local master branch and the master branch in our remote repository. That's what you can see right here. We basically have our remote repository, which we point to with the name origin. And inside this repository, we have the master branch. And that's exactly how the connection is established between our local repository and the remote repository. And this remote tracking branch is automatically created whenever we type certain Git commands, for example, git pull or git push, as we saw it in our case. So that's why we have this origin master remote tracking branch right here. So with that, we got the repository on GitHub, the remote repository. But what if we have a colleague now who wants to access this code and maybe add something to it? Well, for that, we can go to GitHub once again and now click onto our repository right here, for example. And now we have this clone or download option. If we click onto that, we could download a zip file, or we can simply use this code right here once again to basically clone our GitHub remote repository right here. Now let's copy that code and let's open a new window in Visual Studio Code like that. And let's open a folder and let's create a new folder. Let's maybe call it clone, because I will clone the repository now like that. Now let's open the terminal and now let's enter git clone like that and paste this link right here. If we do that, we can see that now the entire, that's important, the entire remote repository, the entire content of this repository is cloned or copied into this folder locally on our machine. Now, if I enter git status now, you can see that this is not a Git repository, but if we go to File, Open, and now open this actual folder in here, so this Git folder, like that. And if we then reopen the terminal and enter git status once again, then you can see that this is now indeed a Git repository, because as I said, the entire repository is cloned. And this also means that we can now work in this repository. Now let's say that we add another file, maybe a CSS file, something like that to it. Then we can follow the normal approach. We could say git add and then say git commit added CSS like that. And this is now a change that is saved locally. And now we want to push it to our GitHub repository, of course. But how can we push it now? Well, if we enter git remote right here once again, then you can see that the remote repository is already known right here. As I said, the entire code is basically cloned, and therefore the connection between Git and GitHub is also already established. And if I enter git branch -r right here, then you can also see that we have our origin master remote tracking branch also right here. Now, why am I showing you this? Because this basically means that I can now simply enter git push right here. And with that, the entire code will be updated on GitHub just by adding this command. I can prove this to you by going back to GitHub right here and reloading it. And as you can see, now we have 3 commits in here. The first and the second one we already know, and the third one with the added CSS file. So this means we were now able to kind of clone our GitHub repository, change some code in it, and push it back to GitHub. The problem now is that for our initial user, this one, the first user I created, myself basically, we don't have this style CSS file right here, because right here in this write code editor, we added this CSS file and we pushed the code. But now right here in this project, I don't have this code. For that, I need to kind of download, you could say, or get the code from this GitHub repository. And for that, we have 2 options. One option is this one. We can simply enter git fetch right here. If I do this and press enter, then you can see that some things apparently happened right here, but we still don't see the style CSS file. And that's strange, right? Because we basically said that the master is not equal to the origin master, but somehow this is not reflected right here. Well, this is the reason why we had a look at these remote tracking branches a few minutes ago. Because if I now enter git branch -r once again, then we can see that we have our remote tracking branch right here. And as we can see, our master on GitHub is now basically equal to the master in our remote tracking branch. So this means GitHub and the remote tracking branch kind of include the same code. So if we now check out this remote tracking branch by adding git checkout origin / master, then we can see the style CSS file in here. But the local code on our machine in our local repository does not reflect these changes now. Now to reflect these changes, we have to go back to our master branch right here. And now we can simply say git merge origin / master, because we want to merge our local repository with this remote tracking branch. So if I now enter this, you can see that the style CSS file is now added. And if we now have a look at our branch, we can see that we are in our master branch now. So we have the local change. And if I enter git branch -r, you can see that the origin master is also right here. You can also combine these two steps, so writing git fetch to get the repository code from the GitHub repository to the remote tracking branch, and then adding git merge to kind of merge the code from the remote tracking branch with our local branch by simply adding git pull right here. That's basically what git pull would do. It would fetch the code to the remote tracking branch and then merge it with our local branch in the end. But with that, we now basically have the same code right here in both of our projects. So this could be two users basically. And with that, we also saw the core commands you need if you want to connect Git and GitHub. So what do you have to keep in mind basically? You have to keep in mind the difference between a local repository and a GitHub repository, and that in between these two repositories, you also have these remote tracking branches, which are kind of in between as the connectors, you could say, between the local and the remote repository. And if you enter git fetch, the git fetch command, then you will kind of synchronize the code in your GitHub repository and the remote tracking branch. And if you then enter git merge, then you kind of also add these changes to your local repository. This is how you pull your code basically down from GitHub, but you can also push code up. Then it's important to keep in mind that you refer to the right GitHub repository. We named it origin, but as I said, you can name it differently. And that you also make sure that you refer to the right branch. We always referred to the master branch in our case. And one really final thing before we finish this video, in case you want to delete all that what we did right here, because it was just a test for you and you want to get started with 0, you can delete a GitHub repository by going to the repository of your choice. Then go to settings right here. Then scroll down to the danger zone. That indeed sounds, well, dangerous. And then you can click right here on to delete this repository. If you then enter the name of the repository, in my case this was Git, then you can delete it right here. And with that, this repository is gone. And you can also delete the remote repository, so the connection between Git and the remote repository in GitHub, by going to your code and then simply entering git remote, like that. Then you can see that this is the repository name, git origin. So if you then enter git remote rm and the name of the repository, like that, then you can see that this repository is deleted now. You can do the same thing, of course, also right here in the second code right here, also by deleting origin. And if you then have a look at git remote, you can see that we don't have these remote repositories in our code right here. And with that, we kind of deleted the connection between the Git repository and the remote repository on GitHub. But that's it now finally. So as always, I can only say thanks a lot for watching. Hope to see you in the next videos, and bye.